Imagine a secret so grotesque, so hidden in the folds of American history that it was never meant to see daylight. A story whispered in the dark corners of Kentucky mountains where silence itself carries the weight of guilt. This is not folklore and it is not exaggeration. It is the legacy of a family tree that grew inward, twisting around itself like a serpent devouring its own body, until what emerged was no longer fully human. A man who looked upon his own granddaughter and called her his wife. A bloodline so poisoned that its descendants carried the sins of generations written into their very skin. You were never supposed to hear this story because it is not just about one man or one family, but about what happens when isolation, pride, and secrecy merge into something that mocks the natural order. The Fugate name became a cipher of shame in Kentucky, a word that locals spat with fear, as if saying it aloud would summon the curse itself. It all began in the early 1800s when Martin Fugate, a French orphan, stepped into the remote hollows of eastern Kentucky. He brought with him a rare genetic mutation, one that stained the blood with an otherworldly mark, turning skin a strange shade of blue. When he joined with Elizabeth Smith, who unknowingly carried the same cursed gene, their children were born unlike anything the world had seen before. Not the pale blue of suffocation, but a dark, unnatural hue that made neighbors whisper, "Devil spawn, cursed blood, blue people." At first, the family could hide their shame behind the veil of isolation. But isolation has a price, and when the outside world fades, the only partners left are those who share your blood. What began as survival slowly transformed into ritual. Brothers took sisters, cousins produced children who carried the mark deeper with every generation. And in this crucible of secrecy, a blueprint for genetic collapse was forged. By the time Charlie Fugate was born in the early 1900s, he was not just a child, but the living embodiment of a bloodline that had turned inward too many times. His body carried the residue of 6 generations of inbreeding. His very existence, a warning carved in flesh. But the true horror was yet to come, because this boy, destined to carry so much broken blood, would one day stand before an altar and marry his own granddaughter. The ceremony was real, the witnesses complicit, and the bloodline already rotting from within. The truth about Charlie Fugate was not born in isolation. It was sculpted over centuries like a grotesque monument to defiance against nature itself. To understand him, you must understand the mountains that bred him. Eastern Kentucky in the 1800s was not America as you know it today. It was a land cut off from the outside world, where families clung to their hollers like kingdoms, and bloodlines became prisons. The terrain was brutal, and so was the isolation. No doctors, no schools, no law, only the echo of your own kin generation after generation. In that silence, the Fugates began to believe their curse was not a burden, but a sign. The blue skin became a badge of twisted pride, a mark that separated them from outsiders who would never understand their secret. When neighbors pointed fingers, they called it providence. When preachers warned of sin, they called it destiny. And when science finally tried to enter their hollow, the Fugates slammed the door and called their inbreeding tradition. But what happens when you repeat the same blood too many times? Nature does not forgive, and it does not forget. The 3rd and 4th generations of Fugates bore children who could not speak, who could not walk, who suffered deformities so severe. Midwives whispered of demon births. The blue was deepening, but the damage ran deeper. Hearts formed on the wrong side of the body, lungs that collapsed at birth, scales too fragile to protect a brain already failing to grow. These were not accidents. They were inevitabilities. By the late 1800s, the Fugate name was spoken in government halls, not out of care but out of dread. Reports arrived of children who were not just deformed, but unrecognizable as human. Researchers risked their lives traveling into the mountains not to heal, but to study. The Fugates had become a living laboratory, a case study in human collapse, and the family refused to stop. Every cousin marriage, every uncle binding himself to a niece, every child born into this cycle was fuel poured onto a fire that would one day consume the last remaining fragments of their humanity. Then came the birth of Charlie in 1912. He was not simply a baby, but the culmination of generations collapsing inward. His body twisted, his skin a darker blue than any Fugate before him, his mind stunted before it could even form thought. He was less a child and more a prophecy, the embodiment of what happens when pride and secrecy destroy blood itself. And yet the family looked at him not with pity, but with expectation. Charlie was to carry the name forward, even if it meant crossing the final line that should never be crossed. Charlie Fugate did not choose his fate. He was born into it, molded by forces older than his own memory, his body carrying the signatures of centuries of genetic collapse. But the true horror of his life was not in his birth. It was in the path that his family forced him to walk, a path so twisted that even the most hardened men would shudder at its telling. As Charlie grew, the cracks in his humanity widened. He never learned to read. He never wrote a word. He struggled to speak beyond guttural sounds and gestures. His mind was locked in the eternal state of a child. Yet his body matured, and in the eyes of the Fugates, that was enough. Because in their world, blood was not sacred. Blood was currency, and to them, Charlie was not broken. He was valuable. He could reproduce, and reproduction was the only law left unbroken in that hollow. The family began whispering about his future long before he reached manhood. But this time their whispers carried something darker, for by then the family tree had collapsed inward so tightly that there were no distant cousins left to claim, no branches left to explore. What remained were only the closest ties, possible ties that should never have been considered. In their desperation, they crossed the ultimate threshold. When Charlie reached adulthood, the Fugates chose a bride for him, not a cousin, not a niece, but his own granddaughter, Bessie. She was barely 18 when the family decided her womb would be the vessel to carry their cursed bloodline one generation further. The preacher who presided over their union was bribed into silence, his Bible trembling in his hands as he pronounced them husband and wife. The guests clapped not in horror but in acceptance, because by then sin had become tradition and abomination had become law. Think of what this means. Charlie already carried the weight of 6 generations of incest, his DNA collapsing into something barely human. Now he would merge with a bloodline that was not just close but identical, grandfather to granddaughter flesh, binding to flesh genes, folding into themselves until the spiral could collapse no further. The marriage was not just a mistake. It was the final sealing of the Fugate fate, for the children born from this union would not be victims of chance. They would be living proof of what happens when humanity dares to rewrite the boundaries of nature. The Fugates had not just broken the chain of life, they had shattered it beyond recognition. The children of Charlie Fugate and his granddaughter Bessie were never truly children in the way you understand the word. They were born carrying the unbearable weight of a genetic collapse that had been building for nearly 2 centuries. Every one of them a vessel for broken codes, twisted patterns, and biological errors stacked one on top of another until the human form itself began to fracture. The midwives who delivered them spoke of spines bent like branches, struck by lightning, of faces that seemed sculpted by something cruel and careless, of organs arranged in ways that defied every chart of anatomy. Some newborns gasped for air only to suffocate within minutes. Others lingered for weeks, writhing in pain before their frail bodies surrendered. The ones who survived did not survive whole. They lived as shadows of what they might have been, stumbling through a world they were never meant to endure. And through it all, the mark of the Fugates remained written on their skin. The blue that once might have been mistaken for rarity had now become a curse so deep, so permanent, that it seemed to stain the very soul. These children were reminders of choices made long before they drew breath. They were not just born into suffering, they were born as symbols of what happens when a family refuses to let go of its pride, its secrecy, its hunger to remain apart from the world. But the real horror was not in their deformities. It was in the way their existence revealed the limits of human endurance. For when scientists later studied Charlie's bloodline, they found something terrifying. His DNA was collapsing in real time, his chromosomes breaking apart as if the human code itself was unspooling. Every child he produced carried not just inherited disorders, but entirely new mutations. Errors so severe, they seemed less like inheritance and more like creation. It was as though nature had raised a final bar. Ere saying no further, you have trespassed too long. By then, outsiders could no longer look away. Medical men whispered of the Fugates in journals too obscure for the public eye. Government officials recorded their names as examples of genetic ruin, yet the family themselves carried on. The cycle had gone on for so long that they could no longer see it as abnormal. The blue people of Kentucky were now not just a family, but a monument to what happens when blood becomes a prison. And Charlie stood at the center of it all, both father and grandfather, both creation and curse, both the last heir and the final warning. By the middle of the 20th century, the world beyond the mountains could no longer pretend the Fugates did not exist. Whispers of the blue people spread through medical schools and government reports, like forbidden knowledge traveling from one cautious mouth to another. But when researchers finally gained access to the Fugates, what they discovered in Charlie shattered their understanding of human limits. Charlie's blood told a story his body could not speak. Doctors found chromosomes fraying, splitting, breaking apart, as if the code of life itself was collapsing inward. His inbreeding coefficient was measured at a number so extreme that it should not have been possible in humans. A genetic similarity greater than children born of brother and sister, unions multiplied across generations. His DNA was not simply damaged, it was unraveling like a rope pulled too tight until the fibers snapped one by one. To the researchers who studied him, Charlie was no longer just a man. He was a warning, a glimpse into the abyss of what happens when human reproduction is forced down paths it was never meant to travel. Yet the horror was not just in Charlie himself, it was in what he passed on. The children he fathered with his granddaughter carried mutations, stacked upon mutations until their blood looked less like human lineage and more like a broken experiment. Every disease, every hidden flaw, every silent recessive gene buried for generations had found its way into their marrow. They were walking monuments to the dangers of human pride, and still the family refused to admit the truth. They treated the outside researchers as intruders, trespassers against their way of life. In their hollow, this was not abomination. This was tradition. What outsiders saw as collapse, they saw as continuity. The Fugates had grown blind to the very nightmare they had created. Now listen carefully, because this is where you must make a choice as a man watching this descent into darkness. Do you look away and dismiss this as the story of a cursed family far removed from your own bloodline? Or do you recognize what it reveals about the forces that shape us all, about how choices repeated over generations can chain men to destinies they never chose? Comment below with the words blood knows, if you understand the weight of this revelation, if you feel the pull of what it means to be bound by forces written in flesh. Because once you say it twice, you are no longer just a witness to this story. You are part of it. By the 1960s, the name Charlie Fugate had become a secret key passed between scientists like contraband. They did not speak of him in open classrooms or public reports. They studied him behind closed doors in laboratories where silence was enforced more strictly than any oath, because what they found in his blood challenged the very foundation of genetic science. Charlie's DNA carried not just inherited errors, but evidence of something darker, the complete breakdown of human structure itself, chromosomes overlapping where they should separate sequences, repeating where they should end, entire regions of genetic code collapsing into static. It was not inheritance, it was corrosion. And every child born of his union carried that corrosion deeper into the marrow of their bones. For medical institutions, this was dangerous knowledge because it exposed a truth no one wanted to face, that humanity itself can unravel if pushed past its natural limits, that within every bloodline lies the potential not just for strength and continuity, but for decay and collapse. The Fugates were proof that entire families, entire lineages could become biological dead ends. So the records were buried. The files on Charlie Fugate were tucked into archives labeled with language designed to keep the public away. What could not be burned was hidden in journals that only the most determined researchers would ever find. Because to reveal his story was to admit that humanity had boundaries it could not cross without turning itself into something else. And the powers that rule science, government, and society do not easily admit limits. Yet fragments of truth still leaked out. Doctors spoke in hushed tones of the blue people in Kentucky. Geneticists warned their students in coded language about the risks of isolation and incest. But always the full truth was suppressed, locked away as if the knowledge itself was contagious, and still Charlie lived through it all, a breathing reminder of what should never have been. He survived not as a man in control of his destiny, but as a symbol. His existence, a mirror held up to every hidden choice, every forbidden desire, every secret corruption buried inside the human story. The institutions could bury his files, but they could not bury his legacy. And that legacy leads us into the final chapter where death itself could not silence what Charlie represented. Charlie Fugate did not die quietly. His final years were spent in a cabin where time seemed frozen, the walls stained with the weight of generations, the silence broken only by the labored rhythm of his failing lungs. Those who saw him in those years spoke of a man who no longer seemed entirely human. His skin carried the blue stain more vividly than ever before, as though his blood itself had turned to ink. His body twisted his speech, broken his mind, flickering in and out of memory, like a candle burning in the wind. When death finally came, it was not an end, but a release. The doctors who examined him called it heart failure. But those who had lived near him whispered a different story. They said his body had simply given up, that after carrying the burden of centuries of incest, the chain had snapped under its own weight. Charlie was buried not far from the hollow where he was born, his grave unmarked by choice. No stone, no words. Just earth swallowing the man who had become both heir and executioner of his family line. But death did not erase him, for in the years after his burial, researchers and storytellers alike returned to the Fugate name as if drawn by a force beyond curiosity. They sifted through scraps of records, photographs taken in secret, and blood samples hidden away in cold storage. What they uncovered was not just a story of one man or one family, but a chilling truth about humanity itself. That blood remembers, that choices echo not for years but for centuries, that secrets buried in one generation can awaken like curses in the next. And here is where the line between history and myth dissolves, because some say Charlie's descendants still walk the back roads of Kentucky. their skin carrying the faint trace of blue, their lives marked by whispers they cannot escape. Others claim his story was covered up, not because it was shameful, but because it was revealing of how freaking Liu the human design truly is, revealing that if repeated mistakes could unravel an entire family, then what of societies, nations, even civilizations that carry their own hidden corruptions? The story of Charlie Fugate was never meant for you to hear. It was meant to be forgotten, sealed in medical archives and buried in mountain graves. Yet here you are, staring into the abyss he left behind. So remember this the next time you think blood is destiny or tradition is sacred. Some chains are not meant to be carried, some names are not meant to be remembered, and some stories are told only as warnings to those who dare to listen in the dark.